abandon all Aboriginal title and all claims of nationality. And so this is the option to what they call enfranchise. They could become citizens voluntarily, but at a cost, of course, of their own heritage. And to this end, after the 1870s, the Canadians set up the similar boarding schools that you saw in the United States. But this was a chance not to forcibly assimilate people, but to facilitate the process of voluntary enfranchisement. So instead of being taken from your family, we would help you become a citizen. Of course, several thousand children were taken from their parents without permission whatsoever. But it was still somewhat different than the United States. So this mutually exclusive nationality policy in Canada is the main difference that sets the First Nation experience apart. So what you had was a dichotomy, really. The First Nations living on the reservation, their cultures flourished. They kept their languages, and most of them survive to this day. But for those who assimilated, their culture was eradicated. And skipping ahead, the next major thing is that, as in the United States, many First Nations people volunteered to serve in the British and Canadian armies in World War I and World War II, quite valiantly, in fact. And if you remember my previous lectures, the United States gave Native Americans citizenship in 1927, in part as a reward for their loyal services. But in Canada, Native Americans did not get citizenship until 1956. Because the rationale was, if you guys wanted to be citizens, you had the chance to abandon your backwards Indian culture this whole time and become a citizen freely. And if you remember my lecture on the termination and forced assimilation policy in the 1950s in the United States, termination was gradually scaled back after 1968. In Canada, it continued even further. As late as 1969, and shortly thereafter, the famous White Paper of the Minister of Indian Affairs advocated the abolition of all Aboriginal title in the country. So they would eliminate Indians and Native Americans as a separate category for minority status. They would completely do away with it in an effort to facilitate integration of Native Americans into white society. And they would do away with all other minority categories as well, kind of like doing away with affirmative action. And so basically before, they had the chance to be on the reservations and have their own identity. Now they didn't have a choice. You assimilate, that's it. So at this time, America is pursuing a very multicultural, plural approach. Canada is homogenizing. And ultimately this policy was very unpopular, and it really wasn't implemented because there was a lot of opposition from MPs in the Canadian Parliament. And also there was a lot of doubt because the Canadian officials knew this termination policy didn't work in the United States. It hasn't for decades, so why would we try now? So they ultimately didn't implement it.
What year was that?
The White Paper? 1969. 69.
69?
Yeah. And another reason why termination was not implemented was because of a landmark Supreme Court decision that some of you have brought up, called Calder versus British Columbia of 1973. And this decision for the first time acknowledged that Aboriginal title did exist prior to British settlement and French settlement, meaning Native Americans did have a claim to their lands. They were sovereign nations at one point, at least. So the British government and the Canadian government did not have the right to simply go in and arbitrarily extinguish Aboriginal title or dissolve tribal nations, unless they had an evidentiary way of doing it through the courts. If they had enough evidence of why a tribe should be extinguished, they could do so, but they couldn't do it arbitrarily. And while this court decision in and of itself didn't change anything, it was significant because it gave the First Nations finally the chance to assert themselves as a public figure, a visible minority opposition to the white society and its policies. And after Calder, in general, First Nations rights improved ever since. And there were a lot of cases of mercury poisoning in the 70s and severe environmental damage inflicted by Canadian companies. A lot of the water supply on the First Nation reserves were completely poisoned, and you had lots of cases of children born with deformities, lots of starvation, lots of disease and cancer, far more prolific than in the areas populated by whites, only a few miles away in some cases. So a lot of this came to light, and what happened was the Canadian government seemed to notice more and more that Native American conditions were really substandard. So they started to establish health services for Native Americans at government expense to improve the life on the reservation, or the reserve. And the next big turning point was the enfranchisement process after 1985 was abolished. So in other words, that mutually exclusive policy where you can only become Canadian if you abandon Native American identity was finally destroyed. So you could essentially be dual citizens now. You could be both Indian and Canadian for the first time. And keep in mind, this is over a decade after the very liberal changes in the activism and the civil rights movement in the United States. So Canada was essentially a latecomer to recognizing Native American suffering. And the next most prominent case where Native American rights improved was the establishment of the province of Nunavut in 1999. It's a massive province in the northeast of Canada that was finally established as a province for the Inuit nation. They would have their own culture, their own official Inuit language, their own autonomy, and their own cultural protection measures at the expense of the federal government. The Nunavut province, for example, is 69% Inuit, with a population of over 20,000 people. The Yukon Territory in the west is 13% Native American, and the Northwestern Territories are 36% Native American. And all those provinces recognize Native American languages as official, alongside English. And ever since then, you have a greater attention to how certain business transactions and government policies might affect Native Americans. So more and more you see multilateral decisions over business and policy. So you have negotiations between the federal government, between local government, between the different tribes, and between the businesses over how to deal with mining ventures, how to deal with oil and shale oil. So long as it was on Indian land, the Indians had to be consulted. That was a new development in Canadian history. For example, in 2001, there was a deal between the Iroquois, the Cree, the Quebec government, and local businesses over hydroelectric energy in Native American land. And over $3 billion in damages were given to the Cree in recompense. So now, more and more Native Americans are being consulted. In conclusion, Canada's First Nation experience is ultimately pretty mixed. Because Canada is such a huge country and has such a small population, you have the benefit of much less violence and more trade. The Indians were usually left alone. And as a result, their cultures flourished. And you have hundreds of languages that are still surviving very strongly in Canada today, unlike in America where most are dead. However, the other difference, the drawback, is, of course, Canada's mutually exclusive nationality policy. This kept the Canadians from including Native Americans in white life because they simply could not be Indian and Canadian at the same time. And there was huge discrimination for Native Americans both on the reserve and in white society after they assimilated. So keep in mind again, until 1985, a Canadian cannot be Indian and an Indian cannot be Canadian in terms of nationality. However, again, since less violence was necessary, First Nations today are culturally flourishing. So that's the positive. Of course, you have the drawback that on the reserve, just like in the reservations of the United States, social conditions are miserable. The same alcohol abuse, the same domestic violence, rape, malnourishment, and especially environmental damages are rampant across the reserves. They're basically living off welfare just like the United States. And there's huge tension between Native Americans in Canada and the Canadian government over improving Native American life, and especially improving the way the environment is affected by Canadian society. Another interesting point is that unlike the activism in the United States, which took off in the 50s, activism really didn't get going until the 90s in Canada, even though conditions were just as miserable. So it took until 1990 for the First Nations to really assert themselves. And the most famous incident is what's called the Oka crisis in Quebec. The local businesses in the local town wanted to establish a golf course on Mohawk land and build huge strip malls on burial grounds, basically. The Mohawks said absolutely not. And they were in a standoff with police and the military for over a year, and one soldier was murdered. But after that, in general, there were not very many cases of violence between Canada and the tribes, because the Canadian government was very quick to compromise with Native Americans to prevent future tensions. The golf course, for example, was canceled. And after 2012, the movement towards First Nations activism changed very rapidly. It took on a nonviolent environmentalist approach, and that's what they're doing today. The spearhead being the idle no more movement, meaning we're not going to sit back and let this happen anymore. And they usually stage hunger strikes, flash mobs, protesting, picket fences, and they set up tents outside of businesses and outside of government offices, basically like the Occupy movement of New York. And their main concern is environmental changes that are going on under the conservative government of Stephen Harper today. Indians are very concerned that the Canadian government is increasingly giving way to business and money at the expense of Native American life and environment and drinking water. There are new changes coming into effect in Canada that basically pave the way for businesses in Canada to intrude on Native American lands more easily. And Native Americans are not going to stand by and accept this. So they're setting up camp and preventing businesses from coming in. They set up roadblocks to stop the tractors. And the Canadian government argues that this is necessary to promote jobs and business, so Native Americans can get their own jobs. They can have the resources on their own lands cultivated, so they can be a part of this business process. But Indians fear the erosion of their sovereignty, just like in the United States, under the boot of the Canadian dollar. So Indian activism nowadays is more geared towards environmentalism, and they have a lot of support from environmentalists in the United States. But it really still remains to be seen what will happen in Native American life, because this activism has just started last year. So that's the Canadian experience in a nutshell. Any questions about Canada before we start the movie?